So first, let's define Silicon Valley. Everyone talks about Silicon Valley in terms of geography, but it's not. Silicon Valley is a culture, and it's spread beyond America. So London is Silicon Valley to a degree. There is a culture there that's very Silicon Valley-ish. It's a bit more risk averse, sure, but it's there.
Today I'm sitting down with Reiss Jones. Reiss is an inventor and has his own technical consulting agency that runs across mechanical and electrical engineering, software development, and synthetic biology. So this is a little bit of a different format than some of our other conversations, but Reiss and I hope to do many more on specific topics, but this one is much more of a wide-ranging conversation, so you get to meet who he is and get to know me a little bit better. I hope you find it interesting, and remember to go direct. Reiss, what is going on, my man?
I had to Reiss.
No, for everyone that's listening, it's Reiss. It's not Reiss, but I had to do it. How many people call you Reiss?
I don't mind if people call me Reiss. Probably about 30 to 40% of people call me Reiss. Yeah.
Okay.
I have been since school, so I respond to both at this point.
Nice. Cool. Well, hey man, I appreciate you taking some time. Hopefully this will be the first of many. We're going to do something a little bit different for all of you listening out there. This is going to be much more kind of an open conversation. So Reiss and I met each other, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago now.
Yeah,
and
probably longer actually. I feel like
maybe three, maybe. I'm losing track.
Maybe three, yeah.
And in our worlds cross in a pretty interesting way. But Reiss ended up doing some software development work for Cultured Supply, my company, building some AI native software for the algae industry. And the whole kind of premise, it was an early prototype, but the whole premise was building an AI chatbot and market intelligence tool that allow buyers and suppliers to really just connect directly in the market to remove kind of these middle layers of distribution and middlemen. And so that's how Reiss and I really started to talk about decentralization. So he's an inventor, technical consultant, all around interesting guy. And we've talked a lot about decentralization. So we wanted to use today, I think, to really dig deeper into what Going Direct's all about, learn a little bit more about kind of Reiss's background and kind of his interest in decentralization, because I think he has an interesting perspective on it. So thank you, my man, for joining.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great opportunity to dig more into you as well, right? This is going to be a nice conversation to just kind of explore how, as you say, we met, but also how we got onto this topic and what's been driving you as well, right? To even start this podcast. So it'd be nice to get into that stuff.
Cool. All right, so I got a couple places to start. I usually don't start with kind of backgrounds, folks, but I think this one it makes sense to start there because we're gonna dive into all types of stuff going direct. So you made this comment to me on one of our on a trip together, diligence trip, that you're not religious, but you pray often. And so I wanted to just unpack that a little bit. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I'm an atheist, right? But I would describe myself as a religious atheist, which sounds completely contradictory, right? For me, atheism is a strict definition of, do you believe in a metaphysical God or not, right? And I can't. I spent about 3 years of my life spending anywhere between an hour to 2 hours a day in churches just praying, hoping God would appear, and it didn't happen. And the reason why I did that was because I felt like God was very powerful. I noticed that people who believed in God felt rejuvenated. They were so joyful, and they really thrived, and they seemed passionate about the things they cared about. They didn't seem to have a lapse of energy ever. And if they did, they very quickly bounced back because they had this great figure that they could lean on. I just couldn't convince myself. I didn't see any evidence of God being real. And, we can dive into all sorts of philosophy, but this probably isn't the right episode for that. But essentially, I tried to build myself a belief system that emulated the features of God, but in an atheistic way. And I think I found that through Earth, and I think more broadly philosophy.
Cool. No, I thought that was interesting. I share some of that sentiment. I've probably not thought about it as much as you or been as introspective about you as far as role of religion, but so I'm Jewish. I was raised in a household that's half Catholic, half Jewish. Similar to
Mm.
you, I just never found that connection. Whether going to synagogue and praying, I just never kind of found that connection that I think I was hoping for. But
Mm.
I still very much have, like, I'm still very connected to my religion and the belief system and the value system that's connected. So it's a big part of my identity, but that kind of aspect of praying and I guess the religious aspect is something I can share a little bit of that
Do you pray?
common. No, not often.
No,
I
like,
do. I would say I do, but it's not like something I'm doing regularly.
okay, like if it's more like, oh, I'm in a moment of crisis, or I just feel a bit anxious or something, so I'm gonna pray.
Yeah,
Is
I
this
think
almost
so.
reactive?
I think it's more reactive, but I also tend not to even when things are hard. I tend not to be like, oh, I'm going to rely on a higher power just because it's a hard
Mm.
time. Because I feel like you have to put the work in consistently in a way versus just like going to that higher power, that higher thing just when you need it. But I don't know, that's my own complex.
I don't want to go too off topic, but last question on this. I mean, do you feel like prayer always is about trying to get a higher power to intervene on your life, or do you think it's more reflective than that, or if not even reflective, more focusing?
I think where I would go to on this is I grew up when you would go to synagogue. I grew up, and when you're praying, you're just kind of going through the motions rather than being reflected, like
Mm.
necessarily reflective.
The ritual of it.
Yeah, I think it's the ritual of it. And then as I got
Mm.
older, I really try to kind of find that. And it was interesting. I just never found the the reflective nature, or the connection, I should say, the reflectiveness for sure. So I can go to church, I can go to synagogue, I can go to any place of worship and be very reflective now, and
Mm.
any a lot of it has meaning for me, but it's just in a pure reflective manner. There's just commonalities with all major religions that I've seen, like pretty basic stuff, I would say. So anyways, I don't know, well, I
I'd agree
digress.
with that. I'd agree with that, and I'll just quickly add, if there's a book, if any listener here is interested in this topic, really recommend The Way of a Pilgrim. It's written by an unknown author, but it's about prayer without ceasing, and if you just read that through an atheistic lens, it's a great exploration on the reflective part of prayer. But I think this topic of prayer is interesting, right? Because something we want to talk today is about meaning, right? And how decentralization ties in with that. So maybe Jordan, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, for sure. But before we do that, I got to
Okay,
get a little bit more from you. So, because I think
sounds good.
my I think your background's fascinating. I'll let you kind of do a quick overview, but grew up in a small town. I'll just do the highlights. Grew up in a small town in the UK, in England. Didn't chose not to go down the traditional university path. Joined a program called the Thiel Fellowship, which many people may know that's listening on the pod, and is really kind of you have a very interesting perspective on many things, and so maybe just walk us through that, your journey so far.
Yeah, so as a Brit, I would say I grew up in a small village, not a town. I find a lot of Americans say town. It wasn't a town. A town is definitely an overestimate. This is like 1,800 people maximum, you know, and it is the largest village, but it's on three sides. It's just a river, and everything else is just fields. So very empty, and half the year it stinks of chicken manure. So it's that kind of a place. If you're listening, just picture, I guess, the Shire from Lord of the Rings. That's basically what it looks like. So yeah, I grew up there. Grew up, and my parents were working class. Mum was a waitress. Dad was working at a supermarket growing up. And I think, to be frank, I always just had ambitions. And a lot of those ambitions were just tied to technology, really fascinated by biotech. And so I did go to university briefly. I went to Imperial College London to study biology. Was was not super happy with their program. I spent I think within 3 months we were still on dinosaur wingspans, and I was really into genetics and microbes. So, you know, and for context, especially for American listeners, UK universities work completely differently. You know, you pick a course and you are prescribed content. You don't get to pick classes. You know, you can do that a little bit in your second and third year, but not really in your first year at all. And so this is when I started getting more into the startup scene. You know, I started playing around with different projects with some friends, especially in synthetic biology, and which is actually the industry through which we met Jordan, right?
That's right.
And and then yeah, long story short, I eventually dropped out to build a synthetic biology startup. Yeah, and then maybe I just pause there, or I can continue.
Yeah, and what and but that kind of led you to then you went. This is kind of when we you and I first met, and then that led you to the Thiel Fellowship. Just talk to me a little bit about just kind of that experience, and more so, I guess, getting exposed to, like, the Silicon Valley approach. Uh,
Yes.
yeah,
So I was exposed to Silicon Valley. So first, let's define Silicon Valley. Everyone talks about Silicon Valley in terms of geography, but it's not. Silicon Valley is a culture, and it's spread beyond America. So London is Silicon Valley to a degree. You know, there is a culture there that's very Silicon Valley-ish. It's a bit more risk averse, sure, but it's there. And so that was really my first exposure, was when I was exploring the startup space there. As I got involved in things like the Bio Dojo, which is now called the Nucleate Bio Dojo, but it's essentially a hacker house in Boston for 3 months, which is one of the best experiences of my life. Best concentration of talent I've ever experienced as well. Um, was through the Bio Dojo. I That was kind of my first proper exposure to Silicon Valley and the mindset that that it kind of gives people, and and then through that I applied to the fellowship. There's a very long story, but essentially I applied. I think it was like a several month process, and you know, when I was awarded it, I was in a cafe in London. There's like a restaurant that I used to waiter in, so that was pretty nice. And then yeah, you know, as I got more involved in the fellowship, I ended up doing more trips to the US. Although I've never lived there for more than 3 months at a time.
cool, super helpful. So when you think about, obviously, you haven't spent that much time in the U.S., but we've spoken a lot about this. But when you think about kind of the innovation economy, especially obviously meaning technology, US versus Europe, how would you describe the differences between the two ecosystems if you were to, one or two main differences?
Yeah, risk aversion is obviously a huge one. I think everyone's well aware of that. Um, I think another one is how comfortable people are with using valuation as a metric versus profit as a metric. Now, both do prioritize valuation, don't get me wrong, but I think there's a little bit more emphasis on revenues, on profits, and on the more tangible side of the business over in Europe than the US. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a very different, um yeah, I think it's a little different approach, partly because economically you have, just, I would say, a much less dynamic economy in Europe,
Mm,
just with how rules, regulations, how the risk
culture.
aversion culture, all those things. So I think it just
Yeah.
kind of comes, that
And
it just
I
comes
think
with
the
the differences.
culture, sorry, I cut you off. Please continue.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the culture is a really important point. You know, Europeans really like their time off. You know, I'm saying that as a European, right? You know, we really, most people, myself included to a degree, work to live. You know, not the other way around, right? And I don't know. You tell me if you disagree, but I think most Americans live to work.
Yeah, I mean, it's the old cliche, but I think I say it very it's very easy, right? So if you want to create something and do something and change something, there's no better place in the world than the United States of America to do that. If you're
Yeah,
looking just for lifestyle, balanced lifestyle, and other pleasantries in life, like, don't go to the US. Like, Europe is much better for that. So it's just a
yeah,
trade-off. And
I
um
agree.
I think people try to compare it too much when, as someone who spends a fair amount of time over in France, it's literally living in two different worlds.
Mm,
It's
yeah.
two different mindsets, two different ways. It's two different ways of living, thinking about the world. I mean, just, I'm generalizing, of course, but
No, I get that completely. You know, one of the most shocking things was as I got more involved in the fellowship, as I got more involved in Silicon Valley, was just how out of place I felt. You know,
How?
as a well, you know, as a Brit that, you know, doesn't come from a well-connected or a wealthy family. That doesn't make me a victim or anything like that. But what it does mean is that I just have different etiquettes. I have different mentality, and I think when I came to Silicon Valley, I really felt, you know, a kind of culture shock, right? Like I really didn't fit in. You know, I there's a lot of power games perhaps we see in the space. You know, a lot of people trying to show off status, and that was completely alien to me. You know, I found that really like saddening actually, but also just pointless. But that's a later conversation perhaps. Yeah, I'd say that was like kind of the big one, and then also just the kinds of behaviors people would engage in or thought were perhaps okay in the name of, um, you know, uh, either boosting their own wealth and power or boosting the wealth and power of their companies. And I say that for Silicon Valley as a whole. You
Sure.
know, both within the geography of Silicon Valley and both and
Sure.
beyond. Yeah.
Well, I think that's an interesting segue where that getting into the going direct thing, right? So I would say, and this I'll speak a little bit from my experience and where we really
Please, yeah.
hit it off. I think at the intellectual level. So obviously we were both active through the synthetic biology world. That's how we originally met. That's what brought us to the algae space. And I think one of the things for me that we connected on and very early on was there was wonderful people working all around the world with very good intentions, very focused on impact in the algae space, really focused on improving human and planetary health and a variety of, you know, applying micro and macro algae to a variety of products in a variety of industries. And one of the challenges that we both saw was they were just unrealistic about how markets work and
Yeah.
how like the real world actually works and around markets, I'm saying, because unfortunately or fortunately, you know, markets are pretty ruthless and they're sociopathic in a way.
Yeah.
And I think
Both
when
the
I,
markets themselves and the people behind them in many cases.
yes. And for me, this was just another example, I think, of where I found myself and why I was so motivated to create Going Direct, which was, you know, I started my career in Silicon Valley at a small private equity firm investing in software
Mm.
businesses. So I got trained initially, actually at a Wall Street investment bank, at Credit Suisse First Boston, and then Mainsail Partners is the name of the private equity firm, who's now much bigger. But I joined it when it was a startup. So I
Okay.
got trained in the world of finance and
And
kind
when
of,
was this, Jordan? Give us like a sense of time here.
so this was 2005,
Okay.
2005 to 2000, 2005 to 2007 ish.
So
So
really kind of pre-big kind of tech.
correct. The very beginning, like very beginning days of software and SaaS, and before, you know, software started eating the world, as I'd
Yeah.
like to say. So, and then a few things brought me back personally to Detroit, where I'm from, and I got really involved in the city of Detroit and the redevelopment efforts, and started a couple of nonprofits
Mm.
there, and really got involved with building the entrepreneurial community back in the heart of Detroit. And so I was like someone who was very impact focused, but also very mindful of how markets work, and was trained in this kind of pretty intense Wall Street type mentality, and understood how the world of private equity works. And so I was kind of
Can I just
homeless.
jump in
Okay,
there? I
sure.
just want to jump in there.
Yeah.
Why did you care, first of all? And what's an example of where you saw your care about impact and markets interface in Detroit?
That's a great question. Well, so it was very straightforward for me. Detroit was my home. Detroit's where I'm
Okay.
from. And for most people that don't know the story, I mean, Detroit was the Silicon Valley of the United States, you know, back in the 20s, 30s, thanks to the automobile and the assembly plant. And so you had all the immigrants came to Detroit. There was an insane amount of wealth created there. At one point, the city was 2.2 million people. Now it's down to 700,000. So
Wow.
you had this hub of innovation that literally moves the world today, right? and then it just had this long, brutal downfall the as the country deindustrialized, and there's a bunch of corruption there, and
Mm.
so you had this story, this place which was my home. When you think about impact, there's no more important thing than kind of seeing your home and where you're from
Is
prosper.
it though? Because this is what I'm curious about is why do you care about your home so much? I've met so many people. For example, I've met a few people in Mumbai who really don't care about Mumbai. They just want to leave and they want nothing to do with that city. I think even for me, I really care about my hometown, but I think you care about Detroit almost to another level. So why do you think that is?
Oh man, it's so true. I think there's two things there. So I think anyone that'll tell you they meet people from Detroit, there's something about Detroiters. I think a part of it is it's a blue collar town. I didn't grow up.
Mhm.
I was fortunate. I was not in a blue collar family. I was fortunate that my family had resources and I was able to go to school and not have to take loans, and it gave me kind of a good. I was lucky in the way that I could start my adult life, right?
Right.
But there's something really really strong about Detroiters, which is the people are real, and it's hardworking, it's non-sexy, and so much amazing innovation and amazing music and culture and everything came out of the place that we just have a really big sense of place as Detroiters. And we're taught at a young age that, where it's Midwest, it's just like, just focus on what matters. And what matters is like family values and, the non shiny, sexy things. And that's always really been a core part of who I am and a core part of who my parents were. So that, my upbringing and and so I also, spent a decade of my life dedicated to every single day to kind of the revitalization of the city and how do you bring the entrepreneurial community back. So I'm very connected to it, and will always be. And so I think that. Sorry, the last thing, you got me on my soapbox now about
No,
Detroit.
this is good.
I I think that we're at a place now where um, a lot of people, because they're so transient, don't have roots anymore.
Mm.
And I think roots and having like a home that you're really connected to is really, really important, to feel like you belong somewhere. And I think that's a really, really big piece. You see, the rate of divorce is like 50, 60% now. Like I just,
In Detroit or just generally?
no, just generally
Oh,
in
okay.
the Western world. And so the reason why I bring that up is, and I've had several friends that have been divorced, and the one thing you notice, you have the most important thing is you have to maintain roots or like a place for the children
Yeah.
that is their home, or it could be a place, going to the lake or going to the countryside or something where like customs and traditions and things that they feel like they belong to something. It's really really important. So
Yeah, I get that. And I guess we've spoken roots here in terms of geography and a physical place. But what about roots in terms of work, in terms of God as well? We touched on God earlier.
yeah.
How do you think this kind of interfaces?
Well, I think that I define a meaningful life as meaningful work and meaningful relationships. And so that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But to your point about roots within work, I think it's just how people find purpose is what you wake up and do every day, and they want to feel useful in the world. So, and it's what you do the vast majority of your waking time. So, no, I think plays a really, really big role.
I, th- I think the reason I bring this up is because in our previous conversations, we've often spoken about almost like I don't want to say an idealistic village of sorts where you'd have the blacksmith, you'd have the fisher, you know, and these people were rooted to that physical place. They would leave the village, right? But it was on occasion, and they weren't really connected to the rest of the world in terms of the way we are today. But it meant that they were super connected to that physical place and they were super connected to that physical job. They were the fisher that supplied the village, and everyone came to them for their fish, and they could derive a lot of meaning from that because they are providing something to the community in a very real and tangible way. in a way that I don't think you get when you're typing on a Google Doc, you know? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think you're hitting at the core of what this whole thing is, right? Which we discussed, which is the concept that I just call concept. It's direct exchange, right? So the
Mm.
whole idea behind this, right, is you're absolutely correct, but it comes down to we are completely connected from the products that we buy and the people that make them in today's modern day society. The entire economic system is basically run by middlemen, people that and businesses, corporations that don't make anything. And
Mm.
so, and the reason for me it goes so deep is I actually think, like as you were saying, it brings a source of meaning and happiness in one's daily lives when you actually have a connection to the things that you buy and the people that are actually making them. And I've been fortunate to get an exposure to that, spending time over in France where it's really a core part of their culture, you know. And I get so much joy when I go to the bakery or to the farmer's market,
Yeah.
and like
The
it's my
fromagerie. Yeah, and you get to
yeah,
pick a cheese through the conversation. Yeah, I
totally.
totally get that. I totally get that. And I think, so for context for listeners, I'm currently in South Korea, been learning a lot about farming whilst I'm here, and that's involved a lot of, I guess, kind of blue collar work. Um, literally laboring, like picking blueberries or collecting eggs or whatever it is, And when you go and deliver like a box of eggs to a client, that exchange, especially as like a local farm, that is such a meaningful moment for the client. They really care about the quality of the eggs. They really care about speaking with you. They'll offer you like free food if it's like a cafe or something. It's a really kind of genuine, close connection and a feeling of gratitude. And I could definitely see how in the long term you get a lot of fulfillment from that.
No, totally. And I think this is a good uh, point to kind of discuss the reality. What you were saying, this kind of utopian of having the local blacksmith, the local fisherman,
Yeah.
and as we know, the last industrial revolution brought amazing capabilities with affordable food, medicine, clothing, etc. And it wasn't until recently that we've discussed this, which is with automation, AI, robotics, all kind of coming together, where you can imagine a world where you can build more decentralized systems that could actually compete with these large centralized systems. And I know part of what you're doing out there, Reiss, is kind of really researching kind of the world of automation and robotics. So I don't know,
Yeah.
talk to us a little about what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, sure. So what I'm seeing out here is that Korea obviously has an aging population. I'm sure many listeners are aware of that. And as a consequence, there is a labor shortage. There's a bit more nuance to it. For example, there's a sense of like doing these kind of blue collar jobs is quite dirty and so almost uh, unbecoming in a sense. So a lot of young people just don't want to work on a farm or they don't want to work in a factory. And so people here have no choice but to automate, to literally get rid of the labor shortages, otherwise they just cannot do the work required of them by customers. And so I've noticed there's lots of really interesting little innovations that they've done to try and increase productivity, first of all. And then second of all, try to just avoid having to make an extra hire and, wait 6 to 12 months to actually get someone in, if at all. Um, and so one example of that is here on this blueberry farm that I'm on. They have a completely automated watering system for their blueberry bushes. So they have these pipes with perforations along on the length, and all you have to do is switch on a valve, and it just waters, all of these blueberry bushes immediately, and then you can just turn off the valve. Job done, right? Super simple. Takes like a few minutes. Then they also have some automations for making their own juices. They have a small apple orchard here, so they make some apple juice, but they also do make blueberry juice. And they do this. What I'm noticing is, they're doing this in a very local way. You know, sure, they bought this automation. It's affordable for them. It works, but they're not really scaling that to like dominate, all of South Korea, right? Or to start exporting. They're not really interested in that. They're doing it in a very local way. So they produce these blueberry juices. They sell it at local supermarkets, sometimes government-backed markets as well, um, directly to customers. So they'll have like a van and they'll go out and deliver. This is for lots of different farms that I'm talking about now. And so this capacity that they're building to produce these different products, i.e., they're not just producing blueberries, they're producing blueberry juice or they're producing, frozen blueberries, is really to satisfy the local market. And that allows for many, many farms to exist. And that actually increases the market size for automations, right? In theory, because you can sell to multiple clients. So yeah, I don't know. Does that kind of make sense? Or
Yeah,
is there
for
anything you
sure.
want to dig into? Yeah.
No, I think the question really comes down to, speaking of this on the automation side. I think there's very big, obviously, cultural differences between the East and West, to your point, around
Massively.
totally, like, around just aspirations of of a business or organization, and
Mm,
scaling and growing. And um I'm a believer that, to main if you want to stay true to your core values of doing the thing of whatever it is that you're doing, I think there's very small number of cases where insanely high growth, and you can maintain those core values by growing really, really quickly. I
mm,
think that, um, yeah, so I just think that having this kind of longer term approach and and trying to figure out a market based way to maintain your values is like the things that I'm the most interested in. And you hit on that. So it just kind of brought that thought up into my head. So
yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I think over here there's. Hmm, I'm just going to pause for a second and think about this. It's interesting because they do have certain values here. They do care about the kind of quality of their produce, but they're also very accepting of kind of brutal market reality. When I was at a chicken farm recently, for eggs, so I guess an egg farm really. Had about 40,000 chickens, so quite a large one actually. And they're getting constant orders, and it's actually outstripping their supply. So realistically, they should put up their prices, right? But they do, and there is a part of them that wants to keep prices low as part of this like kind of altruistic drive to make high quality eggs affordable for people. And they can, in theory, continue to do that. But, I think at the end of the day, they will kind of, if it ends up risking their business, if they end up just disappointing so many customers that actually orders decrease precipitously, then of course they'll prefer to raise their prices. So I think in that sense, they really, whilst they have a healthy respect for values here, they have a greater respect for the brutality of markets, and which I think aligns with what you're saying, and is something that we could learn of, especially in kind of the Silicon Valley culture that we have in Europe and the US.
I think that I think that's like a perfect way of putting it. Say it again. You said something. Then the brutality of markets. What was the first part? But it was
Oh
perfect.
no. Well, I think maybe you can replay it, do a rewind sound and replay it. But yeah, exactly. But I think it was something like people have a healthy respect for values, but they have even more
That's right.
respect for the
Okay.
brutality of markets. There you
Okay,
go.
so there it is. Let's repeat that. They have a healthy respect for values, but also a deep, or a level of respect for the brutality of markets, because that's being realistic about how the world works. So
Yeah.
let's dig into that, because that is literally, if I were to say, kind of the core idea behind what you and I guess, are connected on, and what the goal of going direct is really about, is bringing people with that mindset together, because
Yeah.
otherwise you end up on two ends of the spectrum. One is kind of like growth at all costs, doesn't matter about maintaining your value set. Then the other side is like too altruistic, too impact focused, where you're never going to be able to kind of, not never, I shouldn't say that, but it's be very difficult to achieve the things you want to achieve, because markets are how markets are.
Yeah, and I think that. that asterisk is important. There are markets where you can really care about your values and a way that aligns with markets, like bamboo toothbrushes, right? But it's not the kind of thing that's going to rock the world, with impact. Um, so yeah, or you can do something temporarily with like VC backing, for instance, but it's temporary. You're,
Sure.
there's a runway to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, and then the real question, right, that you that everyone's kind of trying to figure out, the techno optimists are, you know, AI is going to enable all this incredible new type of creativity. It's going to reinvent industries, especially in the physical world. It's going to create all this
Mm.
opportunity. And then the doomers are very much like it's just going to create more centralization. The big are just going to get bigger, and we're going to continue to have more of a barbell economy. Do you have a perspective on that?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I'm aligned more with the doomers on this. The truth is, you're using it. Jordan, what chatbots do you use on a day-to-day basis?
I'm pretty consistent chat GPT. I was an early chat GPT user, so it's just in my workflow. That and then a little bit of Gemini.
Okay, yeah, I'm basically the exact same. I really enjoy Dungeons and Dragons. I developed a board game called Goliath 7 years ago, and I use ChatGPT to play that by myself when I haven't got anyone else to play with. And I recently switched to Gemini for doing that. But those are two big companies. You know, one is deeply interlinked with Microsoft, one of the biggest tech companies in the world, right? And is it itself a large tech company, which is OpenAI. The second is another giant big tech company. So 100% we're seeing more centralization through AI. Yeah, and then we can talk about whether it's going to unlock this incredible amount of growth and so on. That's perhaps a separate conversation. What are your thoughts on this, on centralization?
I mean, listen, the reality of it is anyone that sits here and is going to tell you like that they know or whatever, they have to get over their ego. Like I have no clue. I just know that I just kind of say, I would say two things. One, which is the level of, which people have to remember, the level of resources and investment and infrastructure investment these large tech companies are doing because they just generate so much cash is
Mm.
just mind boggling. The announcements, I think Stargate or Starbase, no Starbase, no Stargate. I don't know the Stargate project,
Starbase.
Starbase.
Wait. Sorry, are you saying Starbase is SpaceX's campus?
Uh,
Stargate is, I think, the
Hold on, let me
was it
see.
like the 500 million or $500 billion?
Yeah, if I have a Stargate, that's right. That's the OpenAI
Yeah.
SoftBank thing, big project. So I think I have no idea. Um, I would say that all, at least I can speak personally, and I think
Yeah.
hopefully I know you're the same, but other people that come across this conversation are focused on is how can we use these incredible technologies to bring us back close to what matters rather than kind of
Mm.
stripping away our humanity. And I had a conversation with Joseph Chen, who's the founder of Kaikaku, not too long ago. He's written Young Guys, some amazing writing, and he talks about how loneliness is like the black death plague of our generation. And I really, I really like connect with that. And so the question for us is how we can use these technologies while maintaining our human connection or enabling more human connection. And that's going to be a tough one to achieve. But that's all I'm focused on wanting to do and enabling more to do and talking to people who want that to be part of our daily lives. Personally, I don't know.
Yeah.
What are your
I,
thoughts?
I I want to dig into that in a second, but I will just say when it comes to centralization to decentralization debate, of course, you can always build your own model, right? So in theory, this revolution, and I'm putting that in quotation marks for those who can't see. So you can always build your own, and so in theory, it can always be decentralized. In practice, though, because of how, easy and convenient using ChatGPT or Gemini is, 99.9% of people are going to use the centralized method. And when you start kind of regulating that, getting data from that, pushing people to particular ways of thinking, or acting, I should act, or even creating, I should add, or creating. that's when perhaps we get some problems, right? So, great example of that is, I think with Gemini, if you ask it to do some uh, essentially genetic engineering questions. So, for example, if you want it to generate a plasmid sequence or analyze an existing plasmid sequence for you, it basically throws up an error and says, this violates our terms of service. Um, so, that there's like some uh, inhibitors there for like working on synthetic biology using these chatbots. That's just a small example. Anyway, I think to return to what you were talking about though, which is kind of how can we use this in a way that restores human meaning, that restores connection, and that kind of combats the loneliness epidemic. I guess just to play a devil's advocate, we're seeing that the loneliness epidemic is being enhanced, right?
Sure.
People are getting AI girlfriends. I have friends who are really concerned about some of their friends because they essentially use their AI chatbots as therapists and friends. So they basically came up with a philosophy of, I don't want to put, the burden of my problems on anybody else in the real world, so I'm just going to speak to a chatbot the whole time, right? And that can get you into some pretty dark places. And then AI girlfriends, AI, just really kind of enhance it. More on the male side, we have a real loneliness crisis. So, how over to you? How do you think we can kind of use AI for combating the loneliness epidemic?
I mean, for me, we're kind of already cyborgs, right? So if you walk in a city, if you're on a metro or a train, or you're just walking down the street, I mean, you just watch people. You're in an airport. I mean, we're cyborgs. We're completely like attached to the phone, right? So, you know, some people have the view. This is the aspect that I'm concerned of. I just think that these forces of technology are just too strong, and then
Mm,
I just, for humanity, where we can like figure out how to regulate them ourselves. And then I kind of go back to this kind of the seven deadly sins, right? And like because if you give humans these tools that are just so powerful, like they're just going to commit the seven deadly sins.
yeah,
It's just
gluttony.
too gluttony, man. So there's an aspect of me that I'm like, man, it's super, super, it's just so powerful. And I think what I've just realized is I just want to be really intentional about how we use it and work with other folks that have a similar mindset and invest in other folks that have a similar mindset. And so I don't know, that's how I think about it. I think that's why I go back when I use the term decentralizing the real economy. So when you're
Mm,
saying how can we combat this, I think using this tools to where you can actually have just generally more decentralized production. I'm not saying production on every single street corner, but a little bit less centralized systems of production. If you can hook those into kind of wholesale distribution channels, that the distributor is not really a gatekeeper standing in between the buyer and seller, which is currently how it works today in most industries. And then you create these other new channels of direct marketing, which we've seen what's going on with the creator economy, and I'm really excited about what's going on there. So I think you kind of need all three of those to, I think, build some of these systems that you're talking about to combat, I guess, the negative forces associated with I guess AI and technology, if that makes sense.
yeah, and I think, just kind of separate from that, we can say that AI itself, when paired with robotics, when paired with automation, helps make these automations more widely accessible, across a range of different manufacturing methods. And then, to go back to Korea, if we can get ourselves to a position where automations are cheap and there's a driving force either through an aging economy or through expensive labor that people want to, or comparatively expensive labor, that people want to buy automations right across a particular industry. And those automations are cheap enough for everybody to afford them, even small local farms like the one I'm sitting in today, then we can see perhaps a drive down in cost, and everyone is competing against each other, so they'd all buy automations in theory, and if they can all afford them, then they maintain viability and none of them dominate the other. And to link it back to this point about loneliness, if we can infuse if some of these automations are enabled through AI, then that brings more meaningful work to a greater number of people, and maybe closer connections to other parts of their community, right? For example, delivering eggs. I don't know, but I think this is also a little naive as well.
Sure.
I think, to be frank, because of course, the more automations you have, then in theory, the less workers there are as well. So, it really
Huh.
just depends how does that interface with like growth rates.
Yeah, and then I think the other naivete, which I always talk about, is this goes back to markets, right? Where it's especially in the Western world, like consumers, like they just want pricing. It's about price and convenience. You know,
Yeah, 100%. And
like
and I
any.
think, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh yeah, anyone can claim whatever else they want to claim, and it's like there's a reason why Amazon is Amazon, and um, you know, the consumers vote with their wallet, and it happens time and time again, and it's always the same thing: price and convenience.
And that's a big threat to robotics, actually, and the automation space, because these automations have to compete with incredibly cheap labor in places like Nigeria and India and Vietnam,
Sure.
right? So Um, there's something else we've got to consider. Something we've spoken about before is how, Europe, or let's say the UK specifically, could have been perhaps a potential hub for deployment of robotics. But now that they've just signed this massive trade deal with India, it's far more likely that there's going to continue to be flooded with cheap goods based on cheap labor over in India, and therefore there's little incentive to actually invest in robotics. And it should be said that the UK generally doesn't invest in productivity enhancing capital anyway, but yeah, capital goods.
Yeah, this is like a much bigger, broader question, which comes back to like industrial policy, um,
Mm,
In the West and East, right? So I had Dylan Patel on a couple weeks ago, and I was actually
yeah,
shocked
I
that
love that episode, by the way.
he said,
So
"Nice,
yeah,
dude."
if anybody else hasn't listened, go ahead and listen to that. It's pretty good.
Yeah, he was really good, and it's like it's crazy, man. Like the amount of views and just like organic views that it's just gotten is like has been great. So, but he had this really interesting perspective. I mean, it's common knowledge if you know anything about kind of the Easter or the Chinese approach to manufacturing, and it
Mm,
simply is this, right? Whereas if you have a factory that runs at 15-20% profit margins, and as the factory, because you're growing and you figure out automations or other economies of scale to bring down your costs by 5%, in China, they pass that 5% savings on to the customer in the downstream value chain because they're
yeah,
focused on maintaining market share and keeping a really dynamic market. They're not looking to take that extra 5% or 7% and increase their profits. In the Western way is the complete opposite, especially the American way, where it's like if I have 5% cost savings, I'm not going to drop the price to my customers. I just want more money for myself and my shareholders, right?
yeah, right.
And so it's a true question of industrial policy, and that one is going to be an interesting one to see because I'm just not so sure the West has the ability to like change their not only just not policy but just like the operators to change their mindset, right? You have to change the whole way that capital markets think and work, and I don't
It's a
know.
cultural shift, right? And I think just to break down the West into two big constituent units, and of course there's the other constituent units as well, like Australia. But if we just focus on Europe and the US for a second, Europe is a lot more regulatory. They perhaps have greater capacity and willingness to develop an industrial policy that kind of relies on the government a bit more, which China's does, right? In terms of like how they flood a particular market with subsidies and that kind of thing. Well, subsidies, and then they allow it to mature, and then they take the subsidies away. But I think in the US, there's such a predisposition to free market thinking and very individualistic thinking that it's hard to see how you could even implement a cohesive industrial policy where all of these different private actors are actually acting in cohesion in the national interest. The only place where that seems potentially possible is obviously in defense. But, are you going to do that in, I don't know, like was going to say chip manufacturing, but perhaps just like a silly example is things like, maybe even like steel manufacturing or, small like M8 bolts, for example, or whatever, wherever it might be.
Yeah, honestly, it's almost in a way you kind of have to have a lot of private individuals coming together that have a lot of resources in the US, and basically they put their capital up, they form coalitions to like say this is kind of part of a new modus operandi for at least helping to reindustrialize the critical parts of of industries that they want to reindustrialize. I mean, I have no idea. Like where they're saying, "Hey, I'll put my capital up, and I'm okay earning whatever 7%, 10%, 5% a year, or whatever." I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and how you change those mindsets. I mean, it's a multi-generational task.
Totally.
I think it really starts at the education level at a young age, and I just don't feel that the willingness is there. And it's such a big problem. I was shocked to read how expensive B-21 bombers were. Do you know how expensive they are, by any chance?
I don't.
About $1.2 billion per plane. 1.2 billion. That's
Ooh,
insane, right? And
that's insane.
you know, that's factoring in, R&D costs as well, it should be said. But I mean, that's a lot of money, and I can't help but feel, I'm not an expert on the defense industry, so please take this with a pinch of salt. But I know that they do a lot of, I guess, kind of cost plus. But
Mm-hmm.
second of all, if you've got this mindset of I'm always going to just, take the extra 5% for myself or whatever, and you cascade that across every single product that's involved in the manufacturing of one of those bombers, that's going to really quickly add up. And I just think if you compare that to the cost of, producing a bomber or whatever in China, it's going to be drastically cheaper because each of these constituent parts are being manufactured in a way that the cost is being passed, the cost drops are being passed down to the end customer, and so therefore the overall product is much much cheaper. Does that make sense? Or I
Yeah, of
don't
course.
know.
Yeah, of course. I mean, listen, it's so man. You said a couple of things that I could go on for hours on, which is I can just speak for the USA. I'm not knowledgeable enough about the UK or Europe, but from an economic standpoint, the problem in the US that we have is we've been this whole kind of deindustrialization process
Mm,
has just gone on for so long. um, you know, one could say, 30, 40, probably 30 to 40 years. And so we've built this middleman economy and all these other incentive systems and economic systems in layers of bureaucracy and the managerial class on top of all of it. And if you're an average American family from an income standpoint today, life is not good in the US. I mean, it is just the cost of everything is just it's pretty mind boggling
yeah,
when you
it's
see it.
brutal.
It's brutal, and so I'm someone that's like I said this almost 10 years ago. Things started to not really make sense to me. I'm much more knowledgeable about these topics and issues now because I just did a lot more reading. I've gone through more life experience, but just like I'm someone that always goes by my gut, right? And 10 years ago, I was kind of like seeing things like certain prices, certain things happening in like my local community. I was like, these things just like don't make sense, right? Like, you're paying taxes and like, why aren't like the parks like clean? Right. And like these other like just basic things. And it's just gotten worse and worse. And unfortunately, I think if you want a system level reset, there's a lot to unwind there. So that's a separate conversation. But I want to bring it back here because I have a question for you. As we're kind of coming up to the hour.
Actually,
Yeah,
just
yeah, of
before, I want
course,
to make one
sure,
point, which is that,
sure.
there's another part of this American story, which is, just the cost of things like healthcare, right? Which is a very much
Mm.
capitalistic industry. And I think what we see there is that well, the takeaway from this conversation for me is that capitalism right now is losing, you know, and for good or for bad, it just acting purely objectively, it is losing when it comes to strategy, geopolitical strategy. Non-wholly capitalistic economies like China's are beating and winning. I think what going direct is for me, and what decentralization is for me, is a means by which capitalism can remain capitalism and have a more organic way of becoming competitive with non-capitalistic societies and or economies.
I'm
Do you agree with
writing
that?
down. I am writing
Oh,
down.
okay.
I'm actually
Okay.
writing
He
down
likes
the
it.
line because I want to make sure I flag that one. Okay, cool. Right. So that was actually my next question for you is why do you care so much about decentralization and why do you feel connected to it? And you just answered it.
Voila.
Voila. But listen, I don't know. This goes really deep for me. Like because it goes back to like one core thing, and this is what I don't see anyone really talking about, which the decentralization, if you think about it, it's kind of the core prerequisite, the decentralized production, right? To increase the amount of direct exchange into our lives. And
Yes.
I think maybe because I grew up in a place where, you know, factories ran towns, right?
Mm,
And I grew up in that place where that's the heartbeat of the community and people's lives. And they sponsor the baseball teams and the basketball teams and the football teams. And your neighbor might work, you know, at the factory. And it's just like, and then you're like, oh, he works at the factory that makes X, Y, or Z. And then you're like, then you're connected to that company that makes that product and it creates just a whole new sense of place. I'll give you an example. My grandparents, their families emigrated from on one side from Italy, and so they were the second generation. My grandparents were second generation Americans, and so it was unfathomable for my grandfather to buy a non-American made car. Like
oh, really?
like
Like just on principle, or just like he just
principle. It's like he's
okay.
like, you live in Detroit. You live in Detroit. The entire he was a physician, but his patients and everyone around him like were connected in some way, shape, or form to the auto industry. Is like you buy an American made car. That's
Yes,
what
you
you
don't want to
do.
rock up in a Hyundai. That's not.
When I moved to San Francisco, I was like, it was so funny just watching the cars on the road. It was like being in a different world to me.
Still is today, actually, with all the Waymos and so on.
But anyways, so yeah, it was anyways, that was I think my point around decentralized production is really the key driver of this. And but I think it's much more than that. Like you're saying, it's like you have to plug them into like new distribution systems and new marketing systems to really actually a new business model, new approaches to business model and ownership, right? To change
And I
this.
and I think the purpose of going direct for me, and also the newsletter, um, and just community discussions as well, is figuring out how can we do this, right? How can we push through decentralization to enable more meaning through direct exchange, but also, to make capitalism more competitive in terms of geopolitical strategy. It's a difficult question, right? We don't have all the answers, but this is what I want to engage with people more on, and I think this podcast is a means to do that. Just one last point on the
Sure.
company towns, unless you've got something to add to that.
No, I think I just real quick before I forget it. I mean, I think this idea of how you make capitalism competitive again from a geopolitical sense and decentralization is a way of doing that is I think is a nice way to put it. And so, yeah, I just like really like that framing in general. So,
Well, I
go ahead.
think because it's inherently isolationist, right? It's like inherently focused on local areas supplying local demands. So, for example, if you had a very localized, architecture and building industry, right, around, small cities, for example, that used only local materials, and, potentially using those local materials is cheaper because of lower logistical costs or whatever, then, that is inherently going to shield itself from foreign competition, right? Unless there's like a major new innovation that comes in and disrupts the whole thing. But this is why perhaps we have to keep decentralized networks always at the cutting edge. There always has to be an innovation aspect to it. I think the other thing I wanted to add from earlier, because it made my patriotic side come out a little bit, is that you mentioned factory towns, right? And the British really innovated in this since it started the Industrial Revolution.
Sure.
And there's this amazing company town that you have to check out next time you're in the UK. It's called Bourneville, and it's where the Cadbury's factory initially was. And there still is, I think, a small amount of production there. Now, Cadbury's was built by Quakers, and these are British Quakers, which are very different from American Quakers. They tend to be. Go ahead.
What's the name of the town? Bourneville?
Bourneville, Bourne, and then Ville.
Okay.
And you can, if you go to the UK, you can actually buy Bourneville chocolate, which is, I think, still manufactured at that plant. And they just had a really radical way of building these factory towns. Typically they were built as just terraced houses, lots of smog, not a very pleasant place to live. But the Quakers who were behind the creation of Cadbury's, they really wanted it to be full of greenery. They had these learning centres where people could learn arithmetic, accountancy. I think they could even study second languages. There's a great Rest is History podcast on this. It's called, I think The Rest is History Does Chocolate or something like that. And they just cover it in quite a lot of detail. And I think the really interesting thing there is that the community itself actually required them to go to these learning centres and learn a new skill. I think spend like an afternoon a week or something like that. So I don't know. It feels like this kind of mindset has a home in decentralization. I don't know if it truly does, but it was just an interesting little bit of history that I thought was relevant to what you're saying.
No, I think what that represents to me is just intentionality and values.
Yeah.
Right. And so kind of what you kind of see happen now, it's like, okay, I'm gonna go look to where to set up my next factory, who gives me the best tax breaks, and who gets the best tax breaks. I'm of course going to engage the local community. It's going to create jobs. It's going to create a tax base. It's all good stuff. Like it's not nothing. None of it's negative. But I think what you're getting at, which is the point, is it's like, do you really care? Like, are you going to be intentional? Are you going to have the values to do some of those things that you're saying, to really uplift the community? And like, just the reality of it is, in like the pure capitalistic way, and I'm definitely a pro-capitalist, is just like, it's
Same.
it's just turned into like no one actually really caring at the end of the day. Like just being honest about it, like
super cutthroat. And
totally.
I think it gets, it touches on what we said at the beginning of the episode, which is that, and it doesn't just apply to Silicon Valley, but ultimately games of wealth and power, which raw capitalism is one of them, reward sociopathy. And sociopathy, for those who don't know, in a very simple way of defining it, describes people who literally cannot feel empathy. So they don't feel bad about doing cutthroat actions like betrayal or sabotage or whatever to succeed, right, and gain more wealth or more power. And so if you're, building a company, or you're running a company, and you think you can squeeze people for an extra 5% on the total price of the product, you're going to go ahead and do it, right? And that means you're going to be rewarded by shareholders, which means people who have more sociopathic tendencies are going to rise to the top. And if you're going to, you're going to be also rewarded for cutting down salaries as well. So, um, and that makes employees feel less cared for, and it creates a less meaningful work environment. And so, where am I really going with this? I guess what I'm trying to say is that because capitalism itself rewards sociopathy, it's led to this position where it feels really uncaring and it
Yep.
feels really sad and empty.
No, and I think that's a good way to kind of to wrap up on this, which is I think that the hope for going direct, as we've discussed this in detail, is it's like we want it to be a home for people who want to build differently, right? But
Yeah.
but you said there has to be interesting, there has to be true innovation on the edges here. There, we can get into this discussion around pure vertical integration and all these other things. That's a separate conversation. And honestly, man, I think that's just what this is about. And I think going back to what you and I were saying, I think the motivation here is it was just really hard to find a home of discussions
Yeah.
of these topics and of honestly really connecting with like high conviction folks in their whatever respective industry they're in that are really putting it all on the line and going after whatever it is that they care about, but with this value set, right? And so I'll leave with this. I mean, I think we've both arrived here with different paths, but I would say this, which is I think everyone is obviously everyone's really looking for meaning in their work, and especially the entrepreneurial path, folks, like the holy grail is making sure that your incentive structure at your organization is aligned with your values or the outcomes you really want to see. And if you're not really mindful about that, and if you take certain types of capital or go a certain direction, that can get out of whack very quickly.
100%. Right.
So
And I think what we're talking about here is valuation over profits, right? Which we see a
that
lot
is
of in Silicon Valley. If you're if you're incentivized to maximize the value of your shares, right, because you've taken on a bunch of VC capital, then that's what you're going to go and do, and you're going to do that through focusing on marketing above everything else. Maybe you do a little bit of tech development, but really you're not focusing as much on how affordably you can sell products for and how widely you can distribute them, and how can you develop the technology in a way that like minimizes costs. That's not as much as a factor because profit is a second priority.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, but I think the older that you get, you realize that all this stuff eventually reverts back to the mean as well a little bit. So you kind of have,
Fingers crossed.
yeah, for sure. I'm going to leave with one quote because I read it the other day and you mentioned it about empathy. I'm going to close it out with one quote. All right, you ready? This is a quote from Plato. The highest form of knowledge is empathy, for it requires us to suspend our egos and live in another's world.
Okay, and let's close out.
And there it
Thank
is.
you, Jordan.
Thanks, Reiss. We'll do it again soon.
Au revoir. Bye bye.